The scalpel trembled in Mariella's hand as she stood over the patient, sweat beading on her forehead despite the air-conditioned emergency room. 24 hours ago, she'd been just another Cuban refugee with forged medical credentials, trying to blend into an ambulance crew crossing the Mexican border. Now, a man's life literally rested in her untrained hands, and the real medical staff watched expectantly, still believing she was one of them. The deception that was supposed to last just long enough to reach American soil had spiraled into a nightmare where pretending could mean killing. It had started with such a simple plan. Mariella had been a secretary at a hospital in Havana, close enough to medical professionals to learn their language, their mannerisms, their casual confidence around injury and illness. When the opportunity came to join an ambulance crew making a legitimate cross-border medical transport, she'd seen it as destiny. The forger in Mexico City had done excellent work. Her credentials looked authentic, complete with certifications and employment history. The ambulance company, MedCross International, specialized in transporting patients between Mexican and American hospitals. They had all the proper permits, crossed borders regularly, and their staff moved freely between countries. For someone with the right documents, it was a perfect cover. Mariella had paid $15,000, her life savings plus loan she'd never repay, for the forged credentials and the connection to get hired. Her role was supposed to be minimal. Basic medical assistant, someone who could take vitals, help move patients, handle paperwork. She'd studied YouTube videos, memorized medical terminology, practiced with stolen equipment. In the interviews, conducted over video calls, she'd been convincing enough. Her hospital secretary background had taught her how medical professionals spoke, how they carried themselves. The performance had been perfect. The crew she joined seemed professional but incurious about backgrounds. There was Dr. Rodriguez, an older Mexican physician who'd seen too much and asked too little. James, an American paramedic who focused more on flirting with nurses than checking credentials. And Sophia, a legitimate Cuban-American nurse who'd taken Mariella under her wing, assuming shared heritage meant shared experience. The patient they were transporting was a wealthy Mexican businessman who'd suffered a heart attack and needed specialized treatment in Houston. The paperwork was extensive but routine. Border crossings for medical transports involved cursory checks. Authorities focused on the patient, not the crew. Mariella kept quiet, did basic tasks, tried being invisible. Just another medical professional doing her job. The crossing itself had been anticlimactic. Border agents had checked the patient's condition, verified the transport papers, glanced at crew credentials without really examining them. Mariella had held her breath as the agent looked at her forged documents, but he'd been more interested in ensuring the patient was stable. Within minutes, they were through, driving north on Texas highways toward Houston Methodist Hospital. That's when everything went wrong. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd seemed fine during the crossing, suddenly clutched his chest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A doctor having a heart attack while transporting a heart attack patient. James immediately took charge, pulling the ambulance's shoulder, calling for backup. But they were in a rural stretch, 40 minutes from the nearest hospital. Sophia worked on Dr. Rodriguez while James drove, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. The medications weren't working. His heart rhythm on the monitor showed patterns even Mariella recognized as dangerous. James made the decision to divert to a small emergency clinic in a town called Willow Creek. It wasn't equipped for major cardiac events, but it was only 10 minutes away. The clinic was barely more than an urgent care center, staffed by a single doctor and 2 nurses who were immediately overwhelmed by 2 critical cardiac patients arriving simultaneously. Dr. Palmer, the clinic physician, was young, probably fresh from residency, and the panic in his eyes was evident. He stabilized the businessman while the nurses worked on Dr. Rodriguez, but it was clear they needed more hands. That's when Dr. Palmer turned to Mariella and Sophia, seeing their MedCross uniforms, assuming competence. He rattled off instructions, medical terminology flowing fast. Sophia jumped into action, but she was focused on Dr. Rodriguez. The businessman's condition suddenly worsened. Something about fluid in the pericardium, pressure on the heart. Dr. Palmer said he needed to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis. Mariella knew the word from her hospital days. She'd seen it performed once, a needle inserted near the heart to drain fluid, dangerous even for experienced doctors. Dr. Palmer called for assistance, and everyone else was occupied with Dr. Rodriguez. He looked at Mariella, saw medical credentials, made assumptions. She tried to defer, mentioned she was just transport staff, but he was already explaining what he needed her to do. The next minutes unfolded like a nightmare played at half speed. Dr. Palmer handed her instruments, expecting her to know what to do with them. He positioned the ultrasound, talking rapidly about landmarks and measurements. Mariella's mind raced through every medical show she'd watched, every procedure she'd glimpsed as a secretary. Her hands moved automatically, mimicking what she'd seen real medical professionals do. When Dr. Palmer told her to hold the needle steady while he adjusted the ultrasound, Mariella felt the weight of the lie physically. The needle was centimeters from the patient's heart. One wrong movement could puncture the cardiac wall. Her hand trembled, but Dr. Palmer interpreted it as normal nervousness, reassuring her that she was doing fine. He had no idea he was reassuring someone who'd never held a medical instrument with intent to use it. The procedure seemed to take hours, but probably lasted minutes. Dr. Palmer guided the needle, while Mariella held equipment, handed instruments, tried to anticipate needs based on fragmentary knowledge. When fluid began draining, he praised her steady hands. When the patient's vitals improved, he thanked her for the assistance. She nodded, unable to speak, terrified that words would reveal her incompetence. But the crisis wasn't over. Dr. Rodriguez had stabilized but needed immediate transport to a major hospital. The businessman also needed continued care. Dr. Palmer, overwhelmed and understaffed, made a decision that would haunt Mariella. He asked her to ride with the businessman in a helicopter that was arriving, to monitor him during transport. Sophia would go with Dr. Rodriguez in another helicopter. James would follow in the ambulance. Mariella tried to object, claimed she should stay with her crew, but Dr. Palmer insisted. He'd seen her competence during the procedure. The businessman was stable but needed monitoring by someone who understood cardiac emergencies. He actually said those words, someone who understood cardiac emergencies, to a woman who learned medical terminology from television and stolen glimpses. The helicopter ride to Houston Methodist was the longest 30 minutes of her life. Mariella sat next to the patient, watching monitors she barely understood, praying nothing would go wrong. The flight paramedic occasionally asked questions, and she responded with vague medical phrases that seemed to satisfy. The patient remained stable, his wealth having purchased a smooth ride and expert care despite the amateur in their midst. At Houston Methodist, the deception finally unraveled. The receiving team was thorough, professional, and suspicious. They asked detailed questions about the procedure at the rural clinic. Mariella tried to deflect, saying Dr. Palmer had done everything, but they pressed for specifics. What size needle? What approach? How much fluid was drained? Her vague answers raised red flags. The head of emergency medicine, Dr. Sarah Chun, was particularly persistent. She recognized inconsistencies in Mariella's responses, medical terminology used incorrectly, gaps in knowledge that didn't match her supposed credentials. When she asked Mariella to write up the procedure notes, standard protocol for assisting physicians, Mariella's facade crumbled. She couldn't fake the detailed medical documentation required. Security was called quietly. Mariella was escorted to an administrative office where her credentials were examined thoroughly. The forgery was excellent but not perfect. Under scrutiny, small details emerged. A certification number that didn't match the database, a medical school that had no record of her, employment history that fell apart when verified. Within hours, her true identity was exposed. The legal ramifications were staggering. Immigration fraud was just the beginning. Practicing medicine without a license, even under duress, was a serious crime. Endangering patients through misrepresentation added more charges. The fact that both patients had survived didn't mitigate the potential for disaster. Federal agents arrived, and Mariella's journey from fake medical assistant to real defendant began. During interrogation, Mariella explained everything. The desperation that drove her from Cuba, the forged documents, the plan to simply ride along as cover. She hadn't intended to touch a patient, never imagined being thrust into actual medical procedures. The agent seemed to believe her story, but explained that intention mattered less than actions. She participated in a medical procedure while fraudulently representing herself as qualified. The businessman, recovering in the cardiac unit, became an unexpected complication. His lawyers arrived, threatening lawsuits, demanding to know who'd been involved in his care. When they learned an untrained person had assisted in his emergency treatment, their outrage was volcanic. The rural clinic faced scrutiny for not verifying credentials. Dr. Palmer was investigated for allowing unqualified personnel to assist. The ripple effect spread. MedCross International conducted internal reviews, discovering their hiring practices had been compromised. Other employees faced background checks. The legitimate medical professionals who'd worked alongside Mariella were questioned repeatedly. Sophia felt particularly betrayed, having mentored someone she thought was a fellow Cuban medical professional navigating the American system. Mariella's case became a cautionary tale in medical circles. How had someone with no training managed to infiltrate a medical transport team? How had she participated in an actual procedure without anyone realizing her incompetence? The healthcare system's reliance on credentials and assumptions was exposed as vulnerable to determined deception. The criminal proceedings dragged on for months. Mariella remained in detention, her immigration status adding complexity to the medical fraud charges. Her court-appointed lawyer argued she'd been forced into medical procedure by circumstances, that refusing would expose her deception and potentially cost lives. But prosecutors countered that her entire presence was fraudulent, making any participation criminal. Dr. Rodriguez, recovered from his heart attack, provided unexpected testimony. He admitted he'd suspected something was off about Mariella, but hadn't pursued it. In the medical transport world, he explained, people sometimes had complicated backgrounds. As long as they did their jobs, questions weren't asked. His honesty damaged MedCross, but perhaps helped Mariella by establishing she hadn't sought to perform medical procedures. The businessman's recovery complicated matters further. His procedure had been successful, his life saved. His lawyer struggled to claim damages when the outcome was positive, but the principle remained. He'd been treated by someone unqualified, without his knowledge or consent. The violation of trust was worth millions, they argued, regardless of results. Mariella spent her days in detention studying actual medical textbooks, a cruel irony not lost on her. She learned the proper names for everything she'd done wrong, understood in hindsight how close she'd come to killing the businessman. The needle she'd held had been millimeters from catastrophe. Only Dr. Palmer's skill and blind luck had prevented tragedy. Other detainees viewed her with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Most had crossed borders for work, family, safety. She'd crossed pretending to save lives, then actually had to try. The story spread through the detention network, growing in dramatic detail. In some versions, she performed the entire procedure herself. In others, she'd saved multiple lives. The truth was both less and more dramatic. Her family in Cuba learned of her arrest through news reports that made international headlines. Fake nurse performs heart surgery was irresistible to media outlets. The nuances, that she'd only assisted, that she'd been forced by circumstances, were lost in sensational coverage. Her mother stopped answering the phone, ashamed of the daughter who'd embarrassed the family so publicly. The plea deal, when it finally came, reflected the case's complexity. Mariella pled guilty to immigration fraud and practicing medicine without a license. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the more serious endangerment charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by deportation. The judge seemed conflicted, acknowledging that while her actions were criminal, the circumstances were extraordinary. Prison was oddly educational. Mariella worked in the medical ward, now properly supervised, learning legitimate skills. The irony of gaining real medical knowledge after being imprisoned for pretending to have it wasn't lost on her. She became proficient at basic procedures, earned certificates in first aid, learned what she should have known before holding that needle. Fellow inmates included other immigration fraudsters, but none with stories quite like hers. There were fake lawyers who'd given bad advice, Fake teachers who never enter classrooms, but fake medical professionals who performed real procedures? She was unique, a cautionary tale even among those who'd lived cautionary tales. Release and deportation came simultaneously. Mariella was escorted directly from prison to a plane bound for Havana. She carried a folder of legitimate medical certificates earned in prison, useless in Cuba, where her crime was famous. The secretary who pretended to be a nurse, who'd held a needle to a rich man's heart, who'd been caught by her own incompetence at paperwork. Back in Cuba, employment was impossible in any medical facility. Her face was too known, her story too infamous. She found work in tourism, far from hospitals and ambulances. Tourists occasionally recognized her, asking if she was a fake nurse from the news. She'd nod, serve their drinks, wonder what might have been if Dr. Rodriguez hadn't had his heart attack. The nightmares were specific and medical. She'd dream of the needle slipping, of blood filling the pericardial space, of the businessman coding on a helicopter while she watched helplessly. In dreams, her ignorance killed. She'd wake gasping, checking her hands for blood that was never there. The procedure had been successful in reality, but in sleep, every possible failure played out. Sometimes she received letters from other Cubans planning their own escapes. They asked for advice, for connections, for hope. She told them all the same thing. Don't pretend to be something you're not. The border was dangerous enough without adding lies that could spiral beyond control. But she knew they wouldn't listen. Desperation made people believe they could sustain any deception long enough to reach safety. The medical knowledge she'd gained in prison tormented her with understanding. She now knew exactly how dangerous that pericardiocentesis had been, how many ways it could have gone wrong. Dr. Palmer had saved the businessman despite her assistance, not because of it. Every medical textbook she'd studied in detention had chapters on what could have happened. Cardiac tamponade, ventricular puncture, death. Years later, working at a beach resort, she'd sometimes see American medical professionals on vacation. They moved with the same confident ease she tried to mimic, spoke the same language she pretended to understand. Sometimes she wanted to confess, to tell them about the secretary who'd held a needle steady through sheer terror and ignorance. But the story was too strange, too specific, too shameful. The forger who created her credentials was never caught. Presumably, others carried similar documents, worked in similar positions, prayed they'd never be tested as she had been. The thought kept her awake sometimes. Fake nurses in real emergencies, fake doctors making real decisions. Her case had led to increased scrutiny, but desperate people were endlessly creative. MedCross International had survived the scandal, implementing new verification procedures. Dr. Rodriguez had retired early. James worked somewhere else. Sophia, she'd heard, had become an advocate for better credential verification. The businessman had fully recovered, his lawyers eventually settling for an undisclosed sum. Dr. Palmer still practiced, more careful now about verifying credentials of those who assisted him. Mariella's story became a teaching case in medical schools, a warning about assuming competence based on uniforms and confident demeanor. Students studied the ethical implications, the legal ramifications, the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. She'd become educational material, her desperation dissected in classrooms she'd never enter. The scalpel in the emergency room had been the physical manifestation of her lie. She'd held it steady through alone, knowing that trembling would reveal everything. That moment of forced competence, of performing expertise she didn't possess, had defined everything that followed. She'd crossed the border successfully but been undone by success itself, by being too good at pretending until pretending became doing. Sometimes tourists asked what brought her to resort work. She'd mentioned she used to work in healthcare, leaving out the details. They'd nod, assuming burnout or career change, never imagining the truth, that she'd been a secretary who'd held surgical instruments, a fraud who'd helped save a life, a desperate woman whose lie had been tested in the worst possible way and found both lacking and somehow sufficient. The border she'd crossed had been more than geographical. She'd crossed from civilian to medical professional, from observer to participant, from harmless deception to life-threatening fraud. The ambulance had carried her into America, but it also carried her into a situation where borders between truth and lies competence and incompetence, had dissolved in the face of medical emergency. Her story ended where it began, in Cuba, serving tourists instead of saving lives. But she carried the weight of that needle, the memory of holding someone's life literally in her untrained hands. She pretended to be a medical assistant and been forced to be one, discovering that some lies, once told, demand to be lived. The uniform had made her a fraud. The emergency had made her something worse and better. A fraud who'd had to perform, who'd succeeded through luck and terror, who'd saved a life she'd had no right to touch. The scalpel had been steady in her hands that day, held firm by the weight of deception that had no choice but to continue. She'd crossed borders to find freedom and found instead that some performances, once begun, could only end with truth or death. By pure chance, she'd avoided causing the latter. But the truth, when it emerged, had been its own kind of death. The end of one life built on lies and the beginning of another built on the shameful knowledge of what desperate people could do when pretending became surviving.